All right, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us on our very special Caval event arranged in collaboration with Caval's Professional Development Interest Group, PDIG. Firstly, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands across Australia and New Zealand where we live, learn and work. We acknowledge and celebrate the inherent strengths of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and communities and recognise their continuing connection to the land, waters and culture. We pay our respects to the elders past, present and emerging. Hi everyone, my name is Sarah Germain and I'm the Manager of Member Services and Digital Platforms. Just a quick reminder to mute yourselves and to turn off your cameras due to the large number of participants we have here today. We would like to conserve bandwidth and make this an enjoyable experience for everyone. To open for us today, I would like to introduce Jamie McCowan, our Acting CEO of Caval. Jamie has been in the role for the last 10 months and has been with Caval for the last 17 years in a number of roles, including Manager of Member Services and Manager of Language Resources. Over to you, Jamie.
Thank you, Sarah. Welcome, everyone. Although 2020 has been a challenging year so far, the increased move to working, teaching, and connecting online has aided us in being able to offer this unique opportunity outside the regular frames of a PDIG event. So the topic of this upcoming presentation is very timely, as throughout the last few months, more than ever, authentic leadership has been crucial in order to support our teams, colleagues, and other people around us. Gabrielle Dolan was working in a senior leadership role at National Australia Bank when she realized the power of storytelling in effective business communication. Since that epiphany, Gabrielle has found her calling as a global thought leader on authentic leadership and business storytelling. Gabrielle is a highly sought after keynote speaker, educator, and author. She has worked with thousands of high-profile leaders from around the world and helped countless of Australia's top 50 companies and multinationals to humanize their communications. She holds a master's degree in management and leadership from Swinburne University, an associate diploma in education and training from the University of Melbourne, and is a graduate of the Harvard Kennedy School of Executive Education in both the art and practice of leadership development and Women Empower Leadership in a New World. Gabrielle is also the best-selling author of, among other titles, Real Communication, How to Be You and Lead True, and Stories for Work, the Essential Guide to Business Storytelling. Gabrielle has very generously donated 2 signed copies of each of these titles, which will be drawn as virtual door prizes among all the attendees today. So the names and winners will be drawn during a presentation and revealed after Gabrielle's presentation and Q&A session. So without further ado, let us please welcome Gabrielle Dolan with some virtual applause.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you for that introduction. As Jamie said, I used to work at National Australia Bank, and it was there in my role as change manager that I actually started to understand the power of storytelling. I worked with this woman called Merrin, and she shared just some random story with me about a flight she was on. Merrin was a frequent traveler, so she very rarely listened to the safety instructions of the hostess, and this flight was no different. But on this flight, due to really bad weather, they had to abort the landing. And they circled around again and they had to abort a second time. And on the third attempt to land, the captain came over the speaker and said, "We will make one final attempt to land. But before we do, we'll go through the safety instructions one more time." And with that, Merrin said people were actually asking questions and looking for the life jacket and, you know, physically counting the rows to the exit. They had their undivided attention. A few months later, Merrin and I were rolling out a major project across all of NAB. So we're trying to influence, 25,000 employees. Merrin was the project manager and I was the change manager. And when we pulled the HR people together to announce the change, they were going to be the ones impacted initially, I said to Merrin, "What's the one key message you want to get across?" And she said, "I know what they'll be thinking. They'll be thinking, here we go again, another restructure. Let's just keep our head down or go away." But this isn't going to go away. They're going to receive lots of information about it that may not always be relevant, but they need to be paying attention because at some point it's going to impact them and it's going to impact them personally. And I suggested to Merrin to share that story about the flight she was on. And her initial reaction was, what the hell has that got to do with anything? But I convinced her it was on message. So Merrin did share the story. And it's the first time I sat back and observed the power of someone sharing a personal story to communicate a business message. Now, I didn't realize it at the time, but it was a bit of a sliding doors moment for me, because what I started to notice is that the really good leaders were sharing stories. You know, the inspiring leaders that could communicate their message in a really great way were sharing stories. I would go to conferences and you'd watch speaker after speaker, and the brilliant speakers were sharing stories. So I left NAB 15 years ago to teach people how to communicate more effectively and more authentically by sharing personal stories to communicate their business message. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So we've got about 50 minutes or so to talk about this. I'm going to try to keep this as interactive, as engaging, as close to a face-to-face experience that we would have normally had if it wasn't for this global pandemic we're in. So can I really encourage you to open up your chat? I'll be asking you to fill in the chat at a few times at certain points. And we're going to break into breakout rooms too at a similar point. So if you've got any questions at all, any comments, please put them in the chat. I will be stopping at the end for some more questions, but if something comes into your mind and you just go, I need to ask this right now, just put it in there and I'll answer it at the appropriate time. Speaking to this audience today, a group of librarians made me a little bit nervous, and I feel like I need to fess up to something. I'm not a great reader. I'm about to publish my 6th book, but I'm not a great reader. I actually failed my final year of English at school, so just failed. And when I was doing my MBA at Melbourne University, I set myself a challenge to complete my MBA without ever stepping into the library. I know, a very stupid challenge that I failed miserably, and because apparently you're meant to reference stuff. So anyway, let's get into it. Librarians aren't just books, remember. Yes, I know. My sister's a librarian. She often reminds me of that. So as humans, we are hardwired to tell stories. It's what we do. We actually tell stories. And I've got no doubt that you already share stories in your professional lives, that you already share stories. But what I've noticed is that we will have a certain style. And your style is going to be determined by 2 things. Now, I'm just going to share my slides at the moment. Let's just, we've gone right to the end. So testing it out, but not going to that. Not going back to the start. So your style is determined by 2 things. First of all, how purposeful you are with your stories. So when you're sharing your story in a work setting, are you really clear on what the message is? Are you crystal clear on why you're sharing the story? What I find when I work with business people, I go, okay, so just don't worry about the story. Tell me the message you're trying to communicate. And they can't articulate it. They're still talking 10 or 15 minutes later, and they can't be clear on why they're sharing the story. The other thing I see a lot of is, the other thing that determines your style is how engaging your stories are. So when you share your story, are people fully engaged with you the entire time? Or have they stopped listening well before you've stopped talking? So how purposeful you are and how engaging you are will determine your style. Now, this is a bit of a judgmental model. So where we don't want to be is the bragger. So what the bragger does is they tend to tell a lot of stories about themselves. They tend to go on forever. There's sort of no reason for them sharing their story except for them to tell you how good they are. Have you ever been on the end of a bragger story? When they finally finish, you have this little bit of a reaction. I was like, oh, well, good on you. Oh, look at the time, got to go. Now, I'm not suggesting that you don't share stories about the good things you've done. You absolutely can, but you don't want them to feel like you're bragging. So bring in some humility, bring in some vulnerability, bring in some self-deprecating humor. If you're talking about, a good outcome you achieved, maybe focus more on the challenges and the self-doubt you had as opposed to the outcome. So you just don't want your story to feel like it's bragging. The second style I see is the joker. So the joker tells really entertaining stories. Love the joker stories, but the joker misses out on this amazing business opportunity because they don't attach a message to their story. So we end up remembering the story, but there was no message to it. I do a bit of presentation training, how to present with impact. And I'm often, someone often says, I've always been told you should start a presentation with a funny story. If it's related to what you're talking about, then yes. But what you don't want to do is just tell a story purely to be funny and then go on and do, your boring presentation or your meeting or whatever. And the only thing people remember is the funny story that had nothing to do with what you were talking about. The other style is the reporter. So the reporter is really clear on why they're sharing their story. They know the message they want to get across. But the reporter tends to use only business related examples, stories about projects they've worked on in the past or stories about a member of their team. Now, there's nothing wrong with those. But that's the default of the reporter, and that is where the reporter stays. The reporter also tends to bring a lot of facts and figures and statistics into their stories. And the moment you do that, it will lose its engagement. And the reporter also believes that case studies are stories. Case studies are not stories. There's nothing wrong with case studies. They provide really, really valuable information. I actually run a practice on storytelling and I absolutely use case studies, but I know they're not stories. In fact, the book, one of the books as a giveaway prize, the last 3 chapters are all case studies, but they're called case studies. And as we work through the next hour together, that might become clearer why a case study is not a story. And then finally, we have the inspirer. So the inspirer is crystal clear on why they're sharing the story. They know exactly the message they want to get across, but they tend to use a personal story to do that. Now, when I say inspire, I'm not saying that your story has to be the most amazing, inspiring, climbing Mount Everest type story. It doesn't have to be, but do you inspire action? So when you share your story, do people actually do something different as a result of it? Do they feel something different as a result of it? Or do they think something different? So when they hear your story, do you sort of get the reaction where people go, oh yeah, good point, I never thought about it that way? So that's what you're trying to do. You're trying to inspire action to get people to do something different, think something different, and feel something different. A lot of you might be thinking, I just don't have any stories because, I'm normal. Normal is good. Normal is good. Normal is what we relate to. So this isn't about those big life-changing, inspiring stories. It's about the everyday stories that you can link to your message. And that's what can be the most powerful. It might be good to give you an example of what I mean by that now. So I did some work with a risk team. So the entire risk team, I ran through a training workshop. Now, the head of risk, her name was Rosemary. And Rosemary said to me, one of the biggest issues we have is that whenever we're talking to the business units we support around risk management, they just keep thinking it's our responsibility and not their responsibility. They just sort of go, well, you're the risk manager, that's your job. And Rosemary said, it doesn't matter how many times I have told them I cannot manage their risk for them. All I can do is help them manage their risk. The behavior doesn't change. The message doesn't get through. They just keep going, you're the risk manager, that's your job. And they're not taking responsibility for managing their own risk. So this is the story Rosemary started to share. She said, when I was a kid, I grew up on a farm, and growing up on a farm, there was all these dangers we needed to be aware of, but Mum would teach us what to do. So we knew what to do if we ever came across a redback spider in the timber heap. We knew about all the potential traps in the dam after heavy rain, and we knew what to do if we came across a snake in summer. And I remember this really stinking hot day, Mum was yelling at me to get my bike from the front gate. So I ran down the path and then I just froze. because in front of my bike was this massive copperhead snake. But I remembered everything Mum taught us to do. So I played statues and I slowly walked backwards until there was enough space between me and the snake, and I ran back to the house to tell Mum. And I'm sharing this with you because it reminds me of the role we play in risk. All I can do is give you the skills, knowledge, and advice. So when you come across your own copperhead snake, regardless of what that looks like, you will know what to do. Now, I'm going to ask you a couple of questions here. And this is when we can use the chat room, and it can just simply be a yes or no answer. Can I ask you, does that help you understand the role of a risk manager better? So the role of the risk manager plays in risk and you play in risk. So just put it in chat, yes or no, or a thumbs up, or a why. Even people are using why. Yes, yes, absolutely. Yes, definitely. Yes, yes, yes. It does in part. Yes. Okay. Yes. Yes, it does. Kinda. So we're getting a whole heap of yeses and one or two yes, sort of. The other question I want to ask you is, will you remember that story? Do you think you will remember that story? So again, just pump it in. And again, we're seeing a whole lot of yeses. Yes, absolutely, absolutely, definitely, definitely. Great example. Yeah, probably. Yes, 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 yes. A sea of yeses. You will remember that story. I have potentially saved your life. If you ever come across a snake, you now know what to do. Play statues, walk backwards, run and tell Mum. So you know what to do. The other question I want to ask you is, do you think you could retell that story without losing its meaning? Now, there's no way known you need to or would have to do it word for word, but do you think you could retell it without losing its meaning? Someone said, I'll teach my son ASAP. Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, people going, yes, yes. And can only try. Great. Absolutely. Like, I've been telling that story. We actually got a farm on the southern New South Wales coast. There's 25 acres. There's snakes everywhere. And through my children hearing that story, they now know what to do. I would suggest to you that some of your fundamental challenges in your role when you're communicating, whether you're communicating to your teams or to customers or to other people, when you're communicating, do people really understand what you're saying and like really understand it? Can they remember it? When the meeting's over, when the presentation's finished, can they actually remember what you said? And can they then retell it to others without losing its meaning? And a personal story will give you more traction on those three things than just facts and figures and data. Because the story creates a metaphor in people's mind. They're able to visualize it. Like, if I asked you, I'm pretty sure you all would have visualized something when I was sharing that story. And if I asked you to draw what you saw, you would all draw something completely different. Half of you would probably draw a cobra, because what the hell does a copperhead snake look like? I've seen people go, I could see the girl. It was so clear. I could see her running down the path. I could see the red bike. And I'm thinking, I never told you the bike was red, but I've given you enough information for you to visualize it. And at some level that is tapped into emotion. Now, when I say emotion, I'm not talking about emotional. I'm not talking you have to be really scared of snakes or anything, or you have to have grown up on a farm, but at some level that is tapped into emotion. Now, the key with emotion, I'm not saying you don't need logic, but the thing with emotion is the brain processes emotion very differently to logic. First of all, it processes it faster. So we make emotional decisions and then we justify on logic. And anyone in traditional sales roles will tell you that. Now, whether we're buying, a pair of shoes, or whether we're buying into an idea, a strategy, a value, a concept, a change, we're buying in on emotion and we're justifying through logic. The brain also stores emotion in the long-term part of the brain. That copperhead snake story is traveling, getting to the long-term part of your brain because at some level it's tapped into emotion. And that is why you're going to remember it. And we know that, we know that. There have been times in our life where we've had a really strong emotional connection to something, that we know exactly where we were and what we were doing when we heard the news. Like, I don't know about you, but I know exactly where I was when I heard about Princess Diana dying. I know exactly where I was when I heard about 9/11. I know exactly where I was when I heard Donald Trump got elected. I mean, you know, other catastrophes that have happened in our life, we know exactly where and what we were doing. And that's the power of stories, what it can do. I can never use that joke on an American audience, so it's always good to do it here. So there's a lot of, I've just seen a question about how long a story should be. I'm going to get to that. I will absolutely get to that. There's a lot of talk about storytelling at the moment. When I started this over 15 years ago, no one was talking about storytelling in a business setting. In fact, people would seriously laugh at me that I left my senior job at NAB to go teach people storytelling. Ooh, once upon a time. But now everyone's talking about storytelling. It is like the hottest thing going around, which is good. People are using story a lot more. But what I'm finding is people are using the word story and not telling a story. They're calling it a story, but it's not a story. Have you noticed the last few years on websites, there's this trend going on where we change the About Us tab to Our Story. Now, I can't help myself, but 9 times out of 10, when I go in and look, there's not a story. A timeline of a company is not a story. Calling something a story is not a story. So what I thought would be probably the most valuable thing I could give you for our time together is that you walk away being very clear on what makes a story, and when you're sharing stories in a professional sense, what are the things you need to consider, you know, like length that someone's asked a question about. But before we get to that, let's be really clear on what makes a story. Now, does anyone shop at the store Reese? Does anyone shop at the store Reese? It's a clothes store. I love. Oh, no. Oh, you did. That was, people are answering it. It was sort of a bit of a rhetorical question, but you can answer it. That's okay. No, everyone's saying no. God, you don't know what you're missing out on. I love Reese's clothes. Love their clothes. But I saw this in their in one of their stores in Collins Street a few years ago, and I picked up the postcard, and on the back, it's just your typical marketing blurb, you know. On the back, it says, "This is our story." And I pick it up and I say, I will be the judge. You can be the judge too. Okay, I need my glasses for this. Did anyone else think it'd be really cool to wear glasses one day? And it's just not. It's annoying. I spent half my time cleaning them and the other half looking for them. But anyway, I need them to read this fine print. Reese is a world-class, modern British heritage brand, positioned between the high street and luxury markets. From one store in London in 1971 to over 130 stores all over the globe today, Reese has established a design-led philosophy centered on creating directional menswear, womenswear, and accessories. It has become an authority on true style for both men and women. Story? I don't think so. There is nothing about that that's a story. And for God's sake, what is design-led philosophy centered on creating directional menswear and womenswear? What is that? What does it even mean? I wear their clothes a lot. I get lost a lot. And until they stick a GPS in the collar, there is nothing directional about that. It's just marketing, corporate jargon crap, for want of a better word. But they've called it a story. Said, this is our story. It's not a story. Exhibit number 2, my younger daughter Jess always suffered from sensitive teeth, so I was always on the lookout for toothpaste that, you know, she'd actually use. And I came across this, and it's called activated charcoal. It's called My Magic Mud, and it's activated charcoal toothpaste. And the first thing, so I pick it up, and the first thing I notice is the price tag. Now, I don't know if you can see that, but it's $18.95. Now, my initial reaction was, there is no way known I'm paying almost $20 for a tube of toothpaste. Anyway, I flip it over and I see our story. And again, I go, I will be the judge. You can be the judge too. Jessica Arman, a mother of 4, an avid entrepreneur, developed My Magic Mud to help with her child's sensitive teeth. What started off as a simple home remedy quickly turned into a successful family business and a platform to inspire others in the community to make magic through entrepreneurship. Now, I don't think that's the best story in the world, but I read that and I thought, good on you, Jessica Arman, good on you. I'm going to buy your toothpaste. I'm going to see if it works. I'm going to use this as an example in my training workshops, which technically makes that a tax deduction. But can you see how that sort of feels like a story? That sort of felt like a story. And this didn't. Like the reaction to this was, this is not a story at all, but that sort of feels like a story. Again, it's not the best story in the world, but I connected to that. So I think it's really important that we understand what makes a story a story. Just someone saying, yes, it felt more human. It felt more human. It did. So I'm going to put you in your breakout rooms now. I'm going to give you 5 minutes for this. They're going to be really small rooms. You should only have maybe 4 or 5 or so in each room, 4, 5, 6, depending on how lucky you are. I want you to discuss 2 things. The first thing I want you to talk about, what makes a story a story? So at a bare minimum, what has to be in it for it to be a story? So that's the first question. What makes a story a story? The other thing I want you to discuss is, what are the considerations when sharing stories, at work, sharing stories in a professional setting? Because there is a very, very big difference between sharing stories with our mates down the pub. Oh God, can't wait for those days again. But sharing stories with our mates down the pub and sharing stories at work. There's a very, very big difference. So what's the difference? So what makes a story? And then what are the considerations when sharing stories in business? And we're going to give like 4 or 5 minutes for that. So you should be all moving to your breakout rooms now. Magic. Well, hopefully you get to have a little chat, meet some new people and talk about what makes a story a story. I might get you to use the chat for a little bit. We might start with the first question, okay? So don't worry about stories in a professional sense or a work sense. Maybe put something in it as a bare minimum, what makes a story a story. Just put them in the chat room, and I'll try to keep an eye on it as 300 answers go by. I'll put my glasses on for this again. Emotional, human, connection, plot. Oh, this is good. This is good. Lots of beginning, middles and ends in there, which I like. Relatable. Once upon a time. I just went like that because one of my big things is you should never start your story with once upon a time unless we're talking to, a child, I think. Simple language. Okay, cool. There's a lot of good stuff in there. A lot of good stuff. Oh, someone said ethos, pathos, and logos. I like that. I bring in that a little bit too. So that's very insightful. A beginning, middle, and end. Some kind of transition. Aristotle's models. Oh, look, you guys are all over it. All over it. So let me talk about some things at a bare minimum, what makes a story a story. And I love who has just said this. Georgina, ensure the story is finished. You are on the money, on the money. Okay, I'm going to share my screen again, and I'm going to take you through a few of the things that you've all come up and spoken about on the chat. So let's start with, at a bare minimum, what makes a story a story? And this is the thing that most of you put in the chat room. There's got to be a sequence. There's got to be a structure to that story. And the structure we stick with is beginning, middle, and end. I was going to ask, who do you think said that? But half of you had already nailed it and know that it's Aristotle. So 2,500 years ago, Aristotle said for a story to be a story, it needs a beginning, middle, and an end. Fair to say it has stood the test of time. So let's not mess with that structure. Don't mess with that structure. And please don't be the person that shares a story without an ending. Don't be that person. Even the never ending story ended. Don't be the person that shares a story without an ending. So it's got to have a sequence, bare minimum. The other thing that has to happen is something has to have happened. You've got to give me like a specific event. Too often in work, we just talk in generalities. We talk in high level. We talk in even hypotheticals. Give me a specific event. Now, the reason this is important because normally without the specific event, there's no story. So if Rosemary, this is a copperhead snake, by the way, in case you're wondering, if Rosemary had shared her story around risk management, but without the specific event of the copperhead snake, if she had just said, when I was a kid, I grew up on a farm. And growing up on a farm, there was all these dangers we needed to be aware of, but mum would teach us what to do. And I'm sharing this with you because it reminds me of the role we play in risk. Can you see how there's no story? There's no story in that because without that specific event, you don't visualize anything. Remember when I was sharing the story about the copperhead snake, you would have visualized it. Without that, you don't visualize anything and you don't feel anything. And that's ultimately what a story should do. It should help people visualize something and feel something. Now, again, when I say the word emotion, you don't have to get people crying or emotional, but at some level, it's got to tap into emotion. Too often in work, we think we're communicating very logical information, so we communicate it in a logical way. We try to get it through their head. The fastest way to the head is through the heart. If you can tap through emotion, it's all this research shows that is the fastest way to the head. If you're ever experiencing that feeling of why can't I get it through their thick head, any of you who have teenage probably experience that on a daily basis. I know I do. But if you're thinking, why can't we get it through their thick head? It's because we're trying to get it through their thick head. The skull's pretty tough. But how you can do it through a story to get through the heart. Now, I'm going to reiterate, you still need logic. Like it still all needs to make logical sense. I'm not saying ditch the logic and just go with the story, but the story will help people remember it. They'll help them understand it and remember it. There's also research that shows that if you put a picture of a brain on your PowerPoint slide, the audience think you're 10% smarter than what you are. So just have a few pictures of brains. No, that's not really true. Don't write that down. So that's at a bare minimum what makes a story a story. Now, when you're talking about stories in a work situation, so that second question we talked about, just use in the chat room again. Mark said 10% yay. Sorry, Mark, it was just a joke. Just in the chat room again, tell me what you talked about are the considerations in business. So what's difference? What's the difference between sharing stories with our friends and sharing stories? I'm keeping it short and simple. Someone said they've laughed out loud twice now. That's good. Mission accomplished. I can finish right here, right now. It's appropriate. Has to have a point. Respect the audience, language, consider the impact of the audience. Oh yeah, related to the topic, to the point. All good stuff, all good stuff. Avoid innuendo. It's got to be relevant, less detail. Yeah, it's got to be, why bother? Why am I telling the story? Okay, all good. Authentic. It's come in right at the end. Not too smutty. No, Jay, I wouldn't have thought it should be too smutty at all. Maybe that's an indication of the stories you share with your friends. Keeping it simple. Okay, so let me go through the considerations of sharing stories in business. So I'm gonna flick to sharing my screen again now, just so you can see them on the screen. So considerations in business, it's got to be purposeful. So I said this right from the start, you've got to be clear on why you're sharing the story. Again, we all know people that share stories and you walk away going, what the hell was that about? You don't want to be that person. Don't want to be that purpose. So it's got to have a purpose. It's also got to be relatable. So when I say relatable, it's not only relatable to the message, but also to your audience. So what I mean by the message, you know how sometimes people share a story and then link it to a message and you sort of go, well, that's a very long, bow to draw. So it's got to be relatable to your message. but it's also got to be relatable to the audience. So relatable and relevant to your audience. Now, this is what I say about your normal day-to-day stories. If you're still sitting there thinking, I don't have any stories that I could use to get a business message across because I'm just normal, nothing major's happened to me, those normal stories are the most relatable. I can tell you one thing we all have in common, a few things we have in common. We were all kids. Stories of us being kids, we can all relate to that. We've all done stupid stuff we regret. We've all done something where we've learned a valuable lesson. We've all been given advice we never took. You know, those stories are highly relatable. So those day-to-day stories will be your most relatable. And once you realize that, you realize, actually, I've got a lot of potential stories I could use. The other one is succinct. Quite a few of you put this in the chat room, and there was even a question about how long your story should be. My sort of rule of thumb, that's when you're sharing a story in a business setting, it should be about 1 to 2 minutes. Rest assured, it doesn't matter how exciting you think your story is or how intriguing you think it is. In a business setting, at work, there will come a point where people will be thinking, if not saying, get to the point. And you want to be finished your story well before anyone is thinking, get to the point, which, depending on your audience, I think kicks in around about the 3-minute mark. So you want to be finished well before that, 1 to 2 minutes. If you're talking to someone that is really just give me the facts type person, maybe make your stories closer to the 1-minute mark. But you're not starting your story with, let me tell you a story. Most of the time you should be finished your story or well and truly through it before they even realize there's a story. So you've got to be really succinct. A couple of other things you've got to be mindful of in business, and one is congruence. I believe storytelling is one of the most respectful ways to communicate and one of the most authentic and genuine ways to communicate, but it's got to be congruent with what you believe. So if you're sharing a story about the importance of work-life balance, you sort of have to live and breathe that. You can't share a story about the importance of work-life balance and, work to midnight and expect your team to respond to emails on the weekend. You've got to live and breathe that. If you're sharing stories about the importance of diversity and inclusion, you want to live and breathe that. So it's got to be congruent. This isn't marketing spin. It's, like I said, it's authentic, it's the most respectful ways to communicate. And there was a lot of talk about authenticity. Some people often say, does your story have to be true? As long as it's believable and gets the point across. Like if it's believable and gets the point across, no harm done, just a little white lie. My advice is it always has to be true. It is not worth the backlash on your own personal credibility to make up stories or to manufacture them or to spin them so they're not yours. I believe the only reason people make up stories is because they think they don't have any stories. They think that their story isn't big enough or no one would be interested in my stories. And the reality is they will. So could you imagine if you heard Rosemary share her copperhead snake story and in the break you said, oh, I grew up on a farm too. I love that story. I grew up on a farm too. Where did you grow up? And she went, I grew up in St Kilda. I just made that up. So Rosemary has now even told you the story is made up, but where's her credibility? It's gone. Can you see it's gone? It's a long way back from that because this feels more than a lie. It feels like a betrayal, and it is a betrayal. It's a betrayal of trust. So it's not worth the backlash on your credibility to make up and to manufacture and to spin stories. It's just not worth it. Your life is rich in stories and you don't need to do it. So that's sort of what makes it, they're the main considerations in business. It's got to be short. It's got to have a purpose. It's got to be relevant to your audience and the right type of story as well. You don't want, smutty stories or sexist stories or stories that just, you think they're funny and they're not. And it's got to be congruent. It's got to be true. Someone talked about logos, ethos, and pathos in the chat room, and this is why I was so impressed because I talk about this as well, and this comes from Aristotle. So I love Aristotle. He was a very wise man, gave us so many cool things to think about. And Aristotle said that when you're trying to influence people, you need three things. You need logos, ethos, and pathos, and you need all three. And logos is logic. So you absolutely need logic when you're trying to influence people. Ethos is personal credibility, and pathos is emotional connection. And he said that you need all three when you're trying to influence: logic, personal credibility, and emotional connection. We might just use the chat room just once more for this and say, tell me what you think the two most important are when you're trying to influence people. When you're trying to influence people, the two most important, is it logic, personal credibility, or emotional connection? Which are the two most important, do you think? Ethos, pathos, credibility, emotional connection. Someone wrote all of the above. It wasn't a trick question. All of the above are important, but there's two that are more important than the other. And the two that are most important, which the vast majority of you have said, are ethos and pathos. It's personal credibility and emotional connection when you're trying to influence people. Yet, we spend the vast majority of our time trying to influence people through logic. Now, again, I'm not saying you don't need logic. You absolutely do. But logic just informs people. If logic did more than inform people, no one would smoke. We wouldn't speed. We'd eat healthy and exercise every day, yet we don't, because logic just informs us. It doesn't influence us, but you still need it. And again, remember, the way the brain processes emotion and logic is very different. We buy into things on emotion and we justify on logic. So we can make an emotional decision, but if we look at the logic and it just doesn't stack up, then we're not going to go there. So you do need both, but we spend too much time trying to influence people through logic and ignoring the power of ethos and pathos. And that can be the real influencing thing. We spend too much time in business trying to lead change through logic, trying to communicate new messages through logic, trying to communicate values through logic. We need to be able to tap into this. So you don't need a story for everything. You don't need a story for everything. If you're just giving a project status update, all you need to do is you can stick with the logic. That's all you need to do. If you're giving, someone asks you what the latest monthly figures are, you don't go, oh, that reminds me of a time when. You just provide the logic. But when you're trying to influence people, you need to step more in. That's when a story can work. If you're experiencing that, why don't they get it? It's so simple. It makes logical sense. Don't throw more logic at it. Use a story, because, again, if you've got teenage kids, you can give them 5 logical reasons why they should do something, and they'll give you 5 logical reasons why they shouldn't. So not throwing more logic at it doesn't necessarily influence people to change. So this is where storytelling can become quite strategic, where you use it. If you want your message to really stick, really be understood, use a story. If you're experiencing that, why don't they get it? Maybe a story could help. If you're doing a presentation about something, maybe start with a personal story that talks about the main message and automatically creates that, emotional connection with your message. So we've probably got about 6 or 7 minutes to go before I hand back. So this is the time to put any questions you have in the chat. I've probably missed something. Sarah, have there been any questions from minutes, ages ago, that I haven't responded to? So I'll answer those first, and then we can get any other questions come up through the chat.
Yes, we had a question here. If you share a story via email, how long is ideal then?
Great question. So stories work really well in the written format. I write a blog every week, and I don't write a story every week, but I try to role model how stories can use, and they work perfectly well in emails or newsletters or on your website. My advice is, though, if when you're saying your story is about 1 to 2 minutes, in the written format, it probably needs to be closer to the 1 minute. So without giving you a word count, I could sort of say maybe a word count of about 300 words or 400 words, but I would say just read it out, and don't read it out really fast. Read it out as you would say it, and try to get it a little bit closer to the 1 minute than the 2 minute. as a bit of a guideline. I mean, it might be a really, really interesting story, and so it could go a little bit longer, but as a guideline, that's it.
We also have someone mentioning storytelling versus truth. Do you find that's a difficult situation in the current environment?
Storytelling versus truth.
Yes.
So my advice is, when you're sharing personal stories, they should always be true, because it's not worth the backlash to your credibility. The current environment, I mean, you know, the fact that we have a term called alternative facts and we use that in replace of the word lying astounds me. But people, there's different stories. There's different versions of the truth. And this is what we need to understand. You know, that go to court, tell me the truth and nothing but the truth. There are different versions of the truth. Something can happen and two people are involved and they take a completely different meaning from it. So I think if you're sharing your story that's come from a genuine place of authenticity, that you believe it, of course you want it to be as true, but it can be as true to you as possible. Have you ever had that experience when you're talking, you know, perhaps you're talking to your brothers and sisters about something that happened when you were kids, and you're going, remember that time we did this, and you're both talking about it, and then your parents go, that never happened that way. And you go, really? Because in my mind, for the last 50 years, it's happened that way. So that to me is the truth. It's the truth. Factually, maybe it's inconsistent, but that to me is still genuine and it's still authentic.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Is it better to not tell a story if you don't have one that effectively transmits your message?
Yeah, so you don't want to tell a story where people walk away going, what the hell was that? And it actually confuses the situation more than helps it. But I would suggest, if you don't have a story, there's two reasons why people say I don't have a story. One is, the first reason is I will say to them, what's your message? And they're not really clear on the message, or the message is just so convoluted they haven't broken it down. That's the one reason. And the other reason is they've got stories, but they're thinking they're not big enough. So they're still, you know, if I push them and say, well, you know, why is that important? Where did you grow up? Or something on the weekend, you could find a story, but they're sort of going, well, why would a story about my kid playing on monkey bars why would anyone be interested in this? So they're not giving themselves permission. One of the things, I know this is a keynote and we only have 45 minutes together, and but you know, when I run the workshops, I get people to share their story, like go find a message and share a story. And the reason I do that is because they experience the power of going, actually, I was really interested in everyone else's stories, so maybe people would be interested in mine, and they can experience the power of it. But give it a go is what I say.
Yeah, that's a great advice, I think. Are there any ways to develop your storytelling abilities? Do you need imagination, creativity, and that sort of thing?
No, you don't need imagination. I'm going to, because someone else has asked a question about my blog post, so I might just share my screen again. And I'm just saying this because this is a really good place to start. If you go to my website, you can subscribe to the database and receive a 7-day storytelling starter kit. Now, I might be a little bit biased because it's my work, but I think that's a very good place to start, hence the name, if you want to start thinking about storytelling. One of the tips, so you literally get an email from me for 7 days containing a really short video, and one of the, you know, a 1 to 2 minute video, right? One of the tips in that is how you start to think of all these different stories. So I take you through a process of how you, if you're sitting there going, I don't have any stories, this is a good way to start. And it will just provide you some examples with start thinking, and hopefully you're lucky enough to maybe win a copy of Stories for Work that I've given a few things of, and that will help you do it. But if you get onto my database, you know, I know a few of you already are. You'll get the 7-day storytelling starter kit, and you'll see examples of, you know, I share stories that my other clients have shared to get their message across. And the more stories you hear about other people doing that, it helps people realize that that's what they could do. And of course, feel free to connect with me on all the regular socials. LinkedIn and Instagram are my most active, I must say. Was there any other questions there that have come up?
What about scenarios? Asking people to imagine something if there is no perfect story to share?
That's called scenarios. So again, to me, it's not storytelling. It's like case studies can be useful, but they're not stories. They're case studies, and scenarios can be useful, but again, they're not stories. It's scenarios. So it's like your typical scenario planning. What could potentially go wrong? So again, it comes back to depending on your purpose, whether that you could use that as a technique to get that going. You could potentially start with a story. So you could start by sharing your own stories. Say it's around change, right? You could share a story around change, and then you can get them. The moment you share your story, it's more likely that they will share their story, and you won't need to rely on, well, hypothetical scenario planning. What would we do? Because it almost always tells me that, well, it's irrelevant because it's not going to happen if we have to think of scenarios. But I know it's used a lot in scenario planning for, in business.
Yeah, I think we have one final question here. I'm sorry if I missed any of them. There's been a lot of good ones coming in. Is it better to have your own story, or is it okay to use others as well?
Both. So it's better to have your own story. I think if you sort of looked on a spectrum of how effective they are, I think your own story is better. You can use other people's stories. So, for example, this is a training session. So I've used the risk management story. It's not my story. But it is my story about Rosemary coming into my workshop, telling me she has this problem, telling me this story and the impact it had on her. So it sort of becomes my story. You could, if you're saying, I love that cophead snake story. I wish I had grown up on a farm. But you could be going, well, actually, I didn't grow up on a farm, but Mum always told us about stranger danger. And I remember one time I was coming home from school and, this creepy man, you could have your own story, or you could say, last week we attended a storytelling session and the presenter shared this story, best presenter ever, you don't have to add that in, and tell the story and tell why it had an impact on you. Can you see how it sort of becomes your story? It sort of becomes your story about being here right now and listening to this. So you can absolutely do that as well. But it just make sure when you're sharing other people's stories, and they could be public stories about, the All Blacks or the Titanic or a movie you saw, just always bring it back to why that's important for you. So what you took from it, the lesson you learned from it, and then it sort of becomes your story.
Yeah, that's excellent. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Gabrielle. You've been amazing today. And I really hope that everyone else has been as inspired as I have been. I think so, because they've all been very engaging and active in the chat. Before we finish up, I want to announce the 4 winners who each will get one of the copies of the books Gabrielle has donated, as Jamie mentioned at the start of the presentation. So the lucky 4 are Susanna Bell from Swinburne University, Heidi Binghai from Monash University, Sarah King from Arnett, and Alice Knishala from Bendigo TAFE. Congratulations, and I'll be in touch with you all shortly to get your details to send the books out to you. As a small token of thanks, PDIG and Cabal have arranged for trees to be planted. For native trees to be planted in areas affected by bushfires. This is through the organisation 15 Trees. So that's a small token of thanks to you, Gabrielle.
Oh, well, that's lovely because, I have a property on the southern New South Wales and spent New Year's Eve in our car at the evacuation centre because of the bushfires. I should have realised that was a sign it was going to be a pretty crappy year, shouldn't you?
Yeah, that's probably the start of it. So I just want to say thanks again to you, Gabrielle. It's been amazing. And I also want to thank the PDIG committee. Without them, this wouldn't be possible either. We hope to see you all at a Cabal event in the near future, with the next one being on the 27th of August at noon on the new normal. Looking forward with fresh eyes. Thank you so much.
See you, everyone.